So far we have studied about self-pollination and cross-pollination. We know the types and we have studied about the agent. Once we have studied these two topics, the next topic that we need to focus on is outbreeding devices. That means these are the devices which will help the plant to breed outside. We will understand soon what is the meaning of breeding outside. Now in general, all the flowering plants are bisexual. That means each flower will have both stamen and pistil. It will have both stamen and carpel. So in this case what happens? There is a most probability of self-pollination. That means pollen grain from the same flower falling on the stigma of the same flower. When there is continuous self-pollination, the plant will undergo inbreeding depression. That means when there is continuous self-pollination, the plant becomes weaker and weaker and it loses resistance, either resistance to water or tolerance to heat, or also it may lose resistance to diseases. And therefore, in order to adapt itself for the new adverse environment, these plants have developed some devices so that to avoid self-pollination, they have developed some devices. So today we are going to study about 4 such devices. The first device is non-synchronization. That is the first one we are going to study. So what do you mean by non-synchronization? You must have heard about the word synchronization. Synchronization means, especially during dance, we say your steps are not synchronized with the others. That means when there is a group dance, all the dancers have to perform the same way so that it becomes beautiful for the eye. That is, if one dancer lifts the left leg, the second dancer also must lift the left leg at the same time. That is called synchronization. Now here we are speaking about non-synchronization. What is non-synchronization we are speaking about? That is non-synchronization with regard to the maturity of stamen and receptivity of stigma. That means the stigma and stamen, that means we have stigma and we have stamen. In the stamen we have anther, and anther will produce pollen grain. So this is the process. So here from here we will get pollen. Non-synchronization means either stamen or anther will mature first and produce pollen grain, or stigma will get matured and get ready to receive the pollen grain. Now if the anther is maturing first, then stigma will not mature at the same time. It will mature either early to that or after that. Or if the stigma is maturing first, then anther will produce pollen grains little later. So this mechanization is called as non-synchronization. So what is the use of this? The use of this is when stigma receptivity and maturity of anther takes place at different time. When the stigma is ready to accept pollen grain, the pollen grains of the same flower are not ready, and therefore it has to accept pollen grain from other plant. So therefore we are avoiding self-pollination. So this is the first device or mechanism that plants have developed over the years. So this is what we should remember. What is the second outbreeding device that we have? Second one is the position of stigma and anther. Stigma and anther. What happens when the position is different? When stigma and the anther are placed little away from each other, the pollen grain of the same flower will not fall on the stigma of the same flower. Thus, we can overcome this self-pollination. So this is the second device that is developed by plants. Now the third device is under outbreeding devices is production of unisexual flowers. Production of unisexual flowers. What do you mean by unisexual flower? Unisexual flower means the flower will have either male sexual organ or female sexual organ, and therefore there is no question of self-pollination, because in one flower only one type of gamete will be there. Either it will have male flower or it is female flower, and therefore male flower has to give pollen grain to another flower. Okay, it can be also in the same plant, usually it will be in different plants. So therefore, especially in papaya, we have male plant and female plant, and therefore male flower is present on one plant and the female flower is present on the other plant, and therefore thus because of this mechanism the self-pollination does not occur in such plants. So this is another device that plants have developed. In this case, the male flower will be called as staminate flower. Male flower is called as staminate flower because it contains only stamen. So it is a unisexual. Male flower is called as staminate flower, and unisexual female flower is called as pistillate flower. Unisexual female flower is called as pistillate flower, and therefore because of this device plants will produce staminate flowers and pistillate flowers. And the fourth outbreeding devices that we have in plants is self-incompatibility. It's called as self-incompatibility. The word compatibility means going well together. Two friends are self-compatible. That means they understand each other, they accept each other. Whereas what we are speaking about is self-incompatible. That means rejecting what is one's own. Rejecting what is one's own. What is your one's own? In this case, the plants will reject the pollen of the same flower. Okay? Here the plant will reject the pollen coming from the same plant. It will not accept. Even by mistake, the pollen from the same flower fall on the stigma of the same flower. Those pollen grains will not germinate because the stigma will not support them, and therefore they will finally fall off. And in this case, what happens? Compulsorily, the stigma will recognize whether it is self pollen or pollen from the other plant. Only when the pollen coming from other plant, it will accept, and finally one or two the pollen grains will germinate by producing pollen tube. And thus with this method it overcomes the self-pollination. So we have seen 4 outbreeding devices. The first one is non-synchronization. That means stamen and the stigma will not mature at the same time. Okay, either one will mature first and then the other will mature later on. And the second one we have is stigma and stamen. Stigma or the anther are placed at a different position. Thus it can overcome self-pollination. And then third one is the production of unisexual flowers. That means flowers will be either male flower or female flower. The male unisexual flower is called as staminate flower, and female unisexual flower is called as pistillate flower. And the fourth outbreeding device is self-incompatibility. That means the plant will not accept, that means the stigma of the flower will not accept the pollen grain coming from that same flower. It will reject the self-pollen. Thus what happens? All these devices will force the plant to undergo cross-pollination. Cross-pollination means pollen coming from another plant, and therefore it will bring different genes, and the progeny will be able to adapt to different environmental conditions and to the different diseases, and thus it can overcome inbreeding depression. And therefore this is a very important topic. They may ask you either for 2 marks or 4 marks in the exam, and therefore understand this.